Good evening, everyone. My name is Liz Heyman. I'm the project manager for this phase of the Bryant Avenue Reconstruction project. Thanks for joining us tonight for this virtual open house for this project. In tonight's presentation, we'll be introducing our recommended concept design for Bryant Avenue and Lyndale Avenue. We'll discuss how Public Works came to this recommendation. We'll do a review of the concept design itself, talk about next steps for the project, and then finally open it up for Q&A. Communication for this project continues to be virtual or over the phone. We really thank everyone for coming out during these formats throughout the last year and participating in this way. We know it's been challenging to be able to keep in touch during these times. Also, as we mentioned in the last open house, due to some COVID-related staffing challenges, we got behind on our email inbox. So we apologize if we haven't gotten back to you yet. We are working our way through those emails. We've read them all and incorporated them into our thinking about this project. But as we noted last time, the fastest way to get an answer to your question is to give myself or my colleague Trey Joyner a call. We've been hosting office hours, myself on Mondays, Trey on Fridays. You can see the times below with our contact information. So yeah, you can send emails, but do reach out via the phone. We can set up a video chat through these hours or by appointment to connect with you. Other thing that we wanted to note is that the city of Minneapolis has declared racism a public health crisis within the city of Minneapolis. We here at Public Works are keeping this declaration in the forefront of our mind as we reinvest in our infrastructure systems and worked to eliminate the racial inequities that are inherent in those systems. We're going to do a round of introductions. I'm joined by a whole slate of colleagues here from multiple agencies and groups. As I mentioned at the outset, my name is Liz Heyman. I'm from City of Minneapolis Public Works, and I am the project manager for the first phase, the concept design phase of the Bryant Avenue South Reconstruction project.
Thanks, Liz. My name is Trey Joyner. As Liz mentioned, I'm an assistant project manager for the Bryant Avenue South Reconstruction project, and I'm associate planner with the City of Minneapolis.
And then I'm Greg Kufal. I'm with Kimley Horn & Associates. I'm a civil engineer who's helping out the city with the concept design portion of this project.
Bev, you may be on mute.
And hi, I'm Beverly Warmka. I'm the project engineer on the design phase of the project with the City of Minneapolis.
Good evening. My name is Cindy Harper. I'm with Metro Transit. I am the Senior Manager of Route Planning.
David Sheen, Hennepin County Transportation Planning.
That was Cole Partridge. We had a little bit of feedback on that one, but that was Cole Partridge from Hennepin County.
Yep. And then, yep, I'll be moderating the meeting today, so I'll kind of go over a little bit of meeting logistics and kind of how this meeting overall will be running. So we will be kind of going through a presentation for roughly about the first 40 minutes or so. We'll kind of detail out some of those things that Liz already described, and then the remaining time and the remaining portion of the meeting, we will open it up to some Q&A. So there is a question and answer portion and boxed over in the corner of your project, or in the corner of your screen. If we can go to the next slide, I think we have some details of telling you kind of how to actually ask a question. So you can ask a question, or if you have any technical issues when you're watching this video, feel free to type a question in there and we can help get that sorted out. So if you are using a computer of any sort on the web version, you should be able to click on the ask a question button in the lower right hand corner. Or if you are on a mobile device, there should be a little Q&A symbol up in the upper right hand corner. Just another kind of technical note, if you are watching on either type of device, if you do actually just click the screen, you will actually pause the question or pause the overall presentation at that time. And if you just click the screen again, you should be able to catch right back up to where the live presentation is at. A couple of things to note with the Q&A is we are trying to keep them project specific and appropriate for this level. So please realize that we are at a public forum here. So please continue to try and keep those questions overall geared towards the project itself. With that, I'll pass it back over to Liz and we'll dive into the actual presentation itself.
Thanks, Greg. So if you followed along this far, most of you probably know, but the Bryant Avenue reconstruction project for Public Works is an opportunity for us to reimagine our right-of-way, as that we will be fully reconstructing from right-of-way line to right-of-way line on Bryant Avenue. We're reconstructing the street because the assets on the street, so the pavement, the sidewalks, have really reached their useful life. If you've been out there, you know that the pavement on Bryant has gotten really bumpy in the last few years here. And we need to make sure that we're investing in that asset so we don't continue to have to spend money on patching it and attempting to fix cracks in sidewalks. The other reason we're prioritizing Bryant Avenue South is because there's many different people using the streets in many different ways. This is a highly multimodal corridor. We have high counts for bicycles and pedestrians, as well as transit users. And so we at the city are prioritizing those types of streets when we are looking at asset condition on top of that to make new investments. A note about funding for this project. So there are assessments that come along with this project for a reconstruction project that will be part of from property owners adjacent to Bryant Avenue South. The assessment amounts do not vary based on the project design. And what I mean by that is that we could pave this street with gold and the amount that we charge to property owners would not change. There is a difference in the rates charged between residential properties and non-residential properties, so it's like a commercial property. But for the large majority of this corridor, it's a typical single-family residential lot. For that type of lot, you would expect to pay approximately $4,500 to $5,500 plus interest for this project. These payments can be made over 20 years. But there's different types of payment terms available. If you have more questions, you can talk to our special assessments office, or if you don't have a typical residential family lot and you want to know a better range for you, their contact information is here below. The other thing to note is for the Bryant Avenue part of this project, our latest very rough estimate is approximately $19 million for this 2.5-mile reconstruction project. And of that 19.4, we expect 2.1 million to be paid from assessments, and the other amount would come from different city sources. So for project schedule, we are wrapping up with this phase of engagement, our concept design part of the project. We're at the end of that, we make a recommendation to the Transportation and Public Works Committee of the City Council. After that recommendation is passed by council, then we move into our detailed design and engineering phase. And during that phase, like the basic elements of the street don't change. So we're here tonight sharing our recommended concept for what the street will look like going until detailed design. We then expect to begin construction in 2022 and having a phase 2 of construction in 2023, given the length of the project. We don't know yet which side of the project, north or south, would go first. We're still working on that construction phasing and that would be worked out during detailed design and engineering. So I wanted to give an overview of what our concept design is and the types of things that go in to this process and what we've heard so far and how we've incorporated that into our recommended design that we're sharing with you tonight. So there's 3 big pieces that go into concept design: our city policy, our technical analysis of the corridor, and our stakeholder feedback, for what we hear when we have conversations like this. So really important to understand that when Public Works comes to a reconstruction project like this, there's a whole suite of policies that guide us and direct us for what is possible and what we can bring out as potential options for a street design. The overarching thrust of these policies is that we are to prioritize our most vulnerable street users first. So that means we're looking to make safe and comfortable and connected routes for pedestrians, people who bike, and people who are taking transit. Is really our guiding policy for how we design these streets. Obviously, there's a lot of balancing act that comes into this, but that's the thing that we keep in the forefront of our minds when we're looking at these city policies. The next piece is, from those city policies, At the outset of this project, Public Works derived a set of project goals. Those goals should probably pretty familiar to some of you, but I'll read them out. We're looking to improve pedestrian safety, access, and comfort. We're looking to create an all ages, all abilities bicycle connection in the area. So that's something that, you know, your 8-year-old would feel safe on riding, and have comfortable crossings and safe crossings at busy intersections. We're looking to support existing and future transit service in the area. Looking to use green infrastructure to collect and treat stormwater runoff. And finally, we're looking to accommodate business deliveries and customer access. So those goals are directly derived from our city policy, as I mentioned. So on top of our city policy, we layer on our technical analysis of the corridor. So looking what's physically out there into the street, what our existing users look like in terms of usage for time of day. And we've done a lot of technical analysis on this project. A lot of it is available on our website. We're happy to share our data with you and have conversations about it. But some of the few examples that we've done are traffic analysis and modeling for Lyndale Avenue. We've also explored traffic patterns on Bryant Avenue South. We've run bus turning movements on Lyndale to test what the turns would look like and what we might need to change to make the turning movements work for transit vehicles. We've walked the corridor to look at where existing encroachments are and to confirm our survey data to see if we could squeeze out, an extra boulevard foot here or an extra parking space in a certain location. We've also done extensive looking at alternative bike routes, so the adjacent streets to Bryant, to see if we could fit in an all ages, all abilities network in a different location. So just a lot of background information that happens so we can come out with realistic options when we share those with you with the public. The last piece that goes into our concept design phase, concept design recommendation, excuse me, is our stakeholder feedback. For this project, we've had 4 rounds of stakeholder feedback, this being our last one. And I'm going to share a little bit about the high level themes that we've heard through those and how we've incorporated those into our recommended design tonight. So throughout this process, as I mentioned at the outset, it's been a pretty challenging time to stay connected with people. So again, I want to thank everyone who's had conversations with us. But when I look back at this, we really managed to reach a lot of folks on some of these online opportunities are probably going to stay with Public Works going into the future, given that they often offer different flexibilities for different types of people to attend. But overall, for this project, we've talked to over 40 businesses via phone conversations and small group virtual discussions. We've attended neighborhood group meetings. We've talked to corridor and resident stakeholders via our virtual open houses, our small group discussions, which were live discussions with stakeholders. We've put up feedback maps, online surveys, so people could send us their comments directly through kind of an easy to use format. We've hosted our discussion hours, and then finally we've, between Trey and I, have just had a whole host of conversations via the phone and email with all kinds of stakeholders in the corridor. So a little bit of what we heard. So starting back in May of 2020, we came out with some questions and materials around corridor visioning and introduced our project goals. And the themes we heard back, these are our most common themes that we heard. People asked us to remember that this is a constrained corridor with a lot going on in it. They asked us to prioritize our vulnerable street users. They asked us to try and slow vehicle speeds, especially on the southern end of Bryant. Some people asked us to de-emphasize space allocated to vehicles. A whole host of people asked us to add greening and boulevard space to the corridor. People asked us to maintain business node parking. And when we looked at these common themes, the ones at the top that I just ran through, we thought they fit in pretty well with the project goals that we had derived from Public Works out of our city policy. But there were some other themes that weren't that well represented, but were common themes that we heard. And those 2 themes were maintaining vehicle access and maintaining on-street parking. So what we did with that is that we used our project goals and these 2 stakeholder priorities to evaluate all of our possible options that we looked at and came up with via our technical analysis. So these were things that we thought we could actually build out on the street. And the 3 main options that we looked at, first was what we called our squeeze it in option, where we tried to fit in everything on Bryant. So that was trying to put transit, parking, pedestrians, a bicycle facility, all within that narrow Bryant right of way. Our second option was our Bicycles on Bryant option, where we would move transit to Lyndale and build a bicycle facility on Bryant. And then our third option was looking at keeping transit on Bryant and moving a bicycle facility to an adjacent street. And when we looked at all the technical outcomes of those options, and you can see kind of our analysis of those, they're up on our website of what those would look like. We really started to hone in on option number 2, as you can see that we felt that it did the best job at meeting project goals and stakeholder priorities. And we wanted to bring out that option as our detailed option that we first shared with the public, because we believe it did the best job at balancing these things. So in December of 2020, we came out with a detailed design for a 2-way vehicular street on Bryant Avenue with like a combination of a shared use path in the southern end and then a separated bicycle trail and sidewalk on the northern end with that shift at 40th. And we came out with an overview and introducing the idea of what it would look like to move transit to Lyndale. And what we heard back from that after we had hosted a virtual open house, as I said, we had feedback maps, we put out a survey. These were the most common themes that we heard. And the first thing we heard was the concerns about the idea of a shared use path. So as I mentioned, south of 40th Street, we had a draft proposal, a shared space for bicyclists and pedestrians to use, so we could carve out more parking and specifically a more green space in that southern corridor. People also had concerns about parking removal, specifically at business nodes with this option. On the Lyndale side, we heard about the difficulty people had when they're walking, trying to try and cross Lyndale, specifically at unsignalized intersections. We had concerns about the lack of detail around the design idea itself, and then concerns about traffic congestion and impacts to Lyndale residents in the area if we were to move transit to Lyndale. So we took those themes back, and then we also had a rollout of our survey. And when we looked at the way that people answered this question and all the conversations that we had, we asked the question, does the draft concept design appropriately balance project goals and stakeholder priorities? You can see that the large majority of people who were engaged in this project said no, it didn't. So we're like, all right, well, we got to go back and think about this some more and look at different ways that we can use the right of way to try and meet those project goals and stakeholder priorities. So we went back to the drawing board a little bit. The first thing we did was we reviewed our alternative bike routes. What I mean by that is we looked at how we could fit in an all ages, all abilities bicycle connection on a DuPont, a Colfax, and Aldridge, and we even looked at if we could put one in Lyndale. And we reviewed our work again to try and evaluate, what might be possible. And what we saw is we really reaffirmed our original take on this issue. And some of the big reasons are, one, an alternative route would be very circuitous. We have direct connections into our existing bicycle network, both north and south of the Bryant corridor that we wanted to maintain. Second reason is that to get in that all ages, all abilities bicycle facility of some sort, we'd be looking at parking removal on adjacent streets and on Bryant Avenue itself. And the reason for that is because with Bryant being as narrow as it is, we're trying to meet our other guidelines of trying to meet minimum pedestrian widths, as well as being able to keep transit running on that street smoothly. It would be too narrow to have what we look for our minimum boulevard and minimum sidewalk, and we'd still be looking at parking removal on one side of Bryant for the large majority of the corridor. So then with this option, we'd be layering on parking removal on Bryant on top of parking removal on an adjacent facility to try and fit in a bicycle facility. That's just a lot of parking removal in this area. It also would mean a really high level investment in this alternative corridor. So as you can see from some of these notes here, there are a lot of unsignalized crossings on busy streets on our adjacent routes, where we would have to put a high level of investment into these intersections and would just be a really large funding outlay for the city in this area of Minneapolis. So for those reasons, we kind of reaffirmed that this option wasn't going to be one that did a great job at meeting the project goals and stakeholder priorities. So we started to think about the one-way option. We had, somewhat considered this idea as a potential option. We'd asked a question about it in our earlier survey, kind of gotten mixed results because we didn't have a lot of detail around people's interest in it. But given the original results, of people's kind of take on the two-way, we started to detail out what a one-way would mean, what the trade-offs would be, and what, traffic challenges we may have with this situation. And when we started to look at it, there were a lot of, really good things that came out of this in terms of our project goals and stakeholder priorities. First thing is we'd be able to fully separate out a bicycle trail and a sidewalk for the full corridor. The second thing is that we'd be able to put in more green space than even we could with the two-way. And then lastly, we'd be able to maintain more on-street parking, specifically at our business nodes. So along with that one-way option, we brought out a detailed drawing of what it would look like and what it would mean to move transit to Lyndale. And Trey can talk a little bit more in the second half of this presentation. So in response to that May draft, the biggest themes that we heard were support for the one-way option, a fair amount of support for that. I mean, obviously we didn't get full support for that, but we started to hear a lot of people seem to think that this might be a good way to balance everything. We definitely heard a desire for a wider bike trail. So in some sections of the corridor where we have our most constrained areas, we are recommending an 8-foot trail, and people were looking for it to be 10 feet wide through the whole corridor. We also heard concerns about traffic impacts on adjacent streets, so specifically speeding, given that we would be restricting vehicle flow in the area. On Lyndale, we heard support for our proposed pedestrian medians, but we heard consistent concerns about traffic congestion and impacts to Lyndale property owners with the addition of transit in the corridor. And Trey's going to talk a little bit about that and what our data says about some of these themes. But when we went back to look at our survey and our final wrap up, and we look at the question, which option does the best job at balancing the project goals and stakeholder priorities, it became pretty clear to us that the majority of people seem to think that the one-way did the best job at balancing all these things. So we at Public Works know that we're never going to get consensus on a project like this, 2.5 miles on Bryant and 2.5 miles on Lyndale. We're never going to be able to meet everyone's desires fully. So for staff, what that means is we go back to our policy. We look at how we can best serve the city today and into the future based on what these whole host of city policies are telling us. And when we take that into consideration with what's physically possible and layer that onto what we heard in this last round of stakeholder feedback, that is how we got to our recommendation for a one-way on Bryant, where we keep a bicycle facility there and move transit over to Lyndale. And you can see here, based on our evaluation, that option really raises to the top for us. We're trying to balance all these things within the right of way. So Trey's going to talk a little bit about, what this concept looks like, some of the details, some of the ways what our data is telling us in terms of impacts. Again, as I mentioned, you can see our full data set for all of our rounds of stakeholder feedback. So our surveys and our feedback map are posted on our website, along with a lot of our technical analysis as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Trey.
Thanks, Liz. So I'll talk about the one-way concept, what that is, what it looks like, and some of the, as Liz mentioned, some of the transit and modeling numbers we got from relocation of transit to Lyndale, and also some of the other features in the one-way design for Bryant. So again, it's one-way on Bryant. It's from Lake Street to 50th Street. It's a converging one-way design where we go from Lake Street to 46 in southbound, and then from 50th Street to 46 northbound. I'll talk a little bit more about why we chose that, why we settled on that configuration. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about the recommended transit proposal. We'll be moving relocating 6 routes. There are 3 local routes and 3 limited stop routes. There'll be 15 stops, 15 consolidated stops, mostly located at signalized intersections, some at unsignalized intersections, and a combination of pull in and pull out lanes. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are in a bit. And then also making accommodations for room for transit amenities such as shelters. And for a small portion in the corridor, I'll note this early here, is between 38th Street and 36th Street will be accommodating a Contraflow transit lane, which I'll talk about in a bit. So for that, I want to talk about some of the modeling that went into making the recommendation to relocate transit to Lindale and why we see that works. So these are conservative. We use conservative numbers. We collected our traffic numbers in 2019 with the interstate construction going on, when we know there's a lot of diverted traffic onto Lindale, and so we projected those numbers out to 2040 and did an exercise in understanding what would be the peak hour PM peak hour travel time, go to one end of the quarter to the other end of the quarter. And as you can see here, prior to or without adding transit, it's about 11 minutes to travel from one end to the other end during the peak hour. And with transit, it's about also 11 minutes. So as you're traveling, you will notice buses on the road because they'll be physically stopping in lane and sometimes pulling out. But as far as the time it takes you to travel from one end of the corridor to the other, it's fairly unnoticeable. So a bit about some of the other transit changes to Lindale. We'll be adding in, as I mentioned, 15 transit stops. At those transit stops, we'll be adding in these carriage walks in many cases to allow transit riders to wait off street in a safe and comfortable place. So you can see that here, the carriage walk to these little extensions here. Also, we'll be adding in pedestrian medians, closed medians at unsignalized intersections. These medians are two-folded. One, to address some of the concerns and feedback we heard during all phases of engagement about the difficulty of crossing Lindale as a pedestrian, but also to allow transit riders to board the transit stop and kind of cross the street in a safe and comfortable environment. We know that medians are a good way to improve sightlines for vehicles when they're looking at pedestrians. Also, they're a great safety tool. Some of the other more substantial changes to Lindale to accommodate transit are the modifications at 50th to the curb lines to accommodate a pull-out stop, which I'll flash in the next slide, and also accommodate turning buses from 50th on to Lindale. So in this location, and kind of where the arrow is pointing out, we'll have to move the curb back a bit to ensure that a bus can turn from 50th onto Lindale and get out of the travelway at a busy intersection, allowing cars to further progress through northbound on Lindale Avenue South. And here's a quick graphic to show the difference between a pull-out and pull-in stop. At some locations along Lindale, we already have kind of like a turn lane that we don't have to build a pull-out stop for. Buses can go ahead and pull out there. In other locations, like 50th, we'll have to build that to accommodate the buses stopping on Lindale. And in other locations, 7 intersections south of 40th, buses will be stopping in lane, particularly because there are lower transit rider numbers, and it works out when you model the ridership that way. Some of the other context around relocation of buses transit to Lindale is that Metro Transit has identified this area as a candidate, or specifically Lindale, as a candidate for bus rapid ABRT in 2040. And ABRT is essentially just half-mile stops, so essentially for a 2.5-mile corridor, we're talking, a minimal number of spots. But ABRT also comes with the addition of these bus shelters. You can see in the bottom left graphic that require a bit of space to accommodate on the off street. So a bit more about the recommended concept for the one-way on Bryant. As you can see here, these are two typical cross sections of what you might expect when you look at or what you'll see when you look at our concepts online. They feature in the first one, we have 2 parking lanes, 2 4.5-foot boulevards, 2 6-foot sidewalks, and an 8-foot off-street bidirectional bikeway. And then in the other typical cross section, we have a 10-foot through lane that's including 2 feet of the gutter pan, an 8-foot parking lane, 2 7.5-foot boulevards that can accommodate some larger trees, and 2 6-foot sidewalks, and a 10-foot bidirectional bikeway. So a bit more about the converging one-way concept. And just the one-way concept in general and the opportunities it presents to address some of our city goals and our stakeholder feedback is that we're able to separate space out for bicyclists. We heard when we came out with our concept in December 20th that the shared use trail that was in the southern half of the quarter wasn't really meeting a lot of stakeholder priorities and in some cases city goals. And so we're thinking when we're able to kind of get more space through the one-way design, we're able to separate those bicycle facilities out. We'll separate the bicycle facilities out, providing a separate space for pedestrians and separate space for bicyclists for the full length of the corridor. Also, we're able to get a lot more green infrastructure along the corridor. With larger boulevards, we're able to treat more stormwater, and also we're able to, as Liz mentioned, get more parking at some of our areas where we know we need a acceptable number of parking, and those are our business nodes. Now, some of the challenges, which I'll talk more about in a bit, my next slide, I think, are the side street impacts for vehicles hoping to travel further north past 46 if you're headed from 50th, or further south past 46 if you're headed from Lake. So the converging one-way design, some of you may be asking, why is that a thing? And it's particularly a thing because of the, for one, we need to get vehicles, since Bryant's kind of hemmed in by Lake and 50th, there's two busy roads. We need to be able to get vehicles from those roads, down into Bryant, but also to in respect to the southbound direction from Lake to 46, we have in this image here is Clara Barton, and Clara Barton Open School has bus loading on the west side of the street, and buses don't have doors on the left side of the bus, and so we have to accommodate how are kids going to load on those buses during those busy school times. And we actually went out to the corridor and observed one of their loading hours, and it's essential that they get the space they need to load the kids onto the bus, because it's an interesting thing to watch. But also in respect to having a northbound one-way from 50th to 46, it's primarily to kind of serve as a confluence for traffic coming off 50th. So a bit more on the traffic impacts. Here, they're showing, it's kind of generally showing what the impacts on the adjacent streets will be because of the converging one-way design. I'll start off with Lyndale. Just to note, Lyndale is a busy road that carries about 10,000 vehicles a day, and during the peak hour, we're anticipating about 65 to 100 additional vehicles on Lyndale. Now, given the scope of Lyndale's 10,000 vehicles a day, that's a pretty unnoticeable amount of vehicles that'll be on Lyndale. And for the adjacent side streets, Aldrich, Colfax, and DuPont, we're expecting about 20 to 35 vehicles a day, which is a modest increase on these residential roads, but that's nothing too exorbitant to where we wouldn't feel comfortable in our proposal to do the converging one-way design. And to address some of the feedback we received during our last round of engagement, where people felt uncomfortable with a one-way design, we got a lot of comments about the speed of which vehicles would travel along a one-way, and that was more akin to the typical one-ways in the city, like Blaisdell. We have two travel lanes. You have a kind of like a wider corridor. This design would be more similar to like a West Minnehaha Parkway, where we have a narrow road cross section coupled with bump outs and on-street parking that's right-sized for the expected use of parking. And that really presents a constrained and also circuitous bit of a meandering corridor that slows vehicle speeds and prevents a more safer and calmer street. And I'll also note that, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be including bump outs, as you can see in the bottom right in our cross section that's posted on our website, but you can also see that on West Minnehaha Parkway as well, where pedestrians are able to cross the street at a shorter distance. So one of the other things you can go out and see that's represented on our cross section now is the bicycle trail or the bikeway. This is an image of 26th Avenue North in North Minneapolis. You can see this is almost exactly the same, very close to what we would have on Bryant, in case we get bigger boulevards. But this is a off-street bidirectional bikeway where we have an adjacent sidewalk. So it kind of separates those facilities along the corridor. Also a bit about the parking spaces on Bryant. While we did add in much more parking than what we had in our two-way cross section, we're also right-sizing that parking to address some of the concerns that we heard during round 1 and round 2 about, again, vehicle speeding towards the southern half of the corridor. When you have underparked parking bays, the corridor appears wider than it actually is, and vehicles feel more comfortable traveling at higher speeds because they don't feel like they're going to hit anything. So we've right-sided those parking and also added in treatments like chicanes. That's that kind of meander that's in the kind of center of the street there. That will also do a lot of service to kind of slowing vehicles as they travel along the street. So I mentioned earlier, I'll talk about the Contraflow Lane that we have to accommodate metro mobility and transit service. This is particularly because we need to get that front door service to Walker Methodist. Walker Methodist has needs due to the nature of its function, has needs for transit at the front door, and we know we want to kind of accommodate them, but also emergency services that frequently travels to that location. And final, one of the great things about the one-way cross-section, one-way proposal is we get to treat more stormwater. Liz may have mentioned this in the beginning, but adding green infrastructure into a project goal is a new thing for Public Works. It's not something we've done on projects previously, and we wanted to make it a priority with this project. And so with the one-way design, we get larger boulevards, we can treat more stormwater, and the larger the drainage area, which is the image which is shown here, and you can view our stormwater numbers on the website. The larger the drainage area, the more you need to treat that area. And in this case, much of the drainage area is in the street, and so treating that drainage area is kind of meets some of those project goals that we have. Cool, and I'll just briefly talk about the next steps. So we'll be taking this project to the Transportation and Public Works Committee. It's a subcommittee of City Council that reviews transportation projects for a proposed adoption. And then after that phase, as Liz mentioned earlier, we'll be going into detailed engineering design where we kind of figure out the nuts and bolts in the street. From that point on, we'll be ongoing outreach to Bryant property owners to ensure that we're having those conversations that we need to be having, and then also preparing for that 2022-2023 construction. Great.
Yeah, okay, and then with that, that kind of ends our overall presentation portion of this meeting so far. So right now we'll transition into the Q&A portion of the project. So please continue. We've gotten quite a few questions already popping up through the chat box. But if you do have a question based on anything that you just heard tonight, feel free to type it in there. We'll be sending out, publishing all the ones that, all the questions that we actually get. We may not publish all of the comments or other small questions like that. We'll be posting all of the questions that we actually get related to Bryant. And again, if you're on the web, you should be able to have a ask a question button that's in the lower right hand corner. And if you're on the mobile version, there should be a Q&A button up in the top right hand corner. But with that, we'll kind of jump right into the actual Q&A portion of the meeting itself. And I think our first question overall, we'll give our presenters just a minute or two to catch their breath and to take a drink of water. So I'll actually take this first one. Is in the one-way design, will parking always be on the right side of the street? And the short answer to that question is no, it will not. To try and get parking to both people on the east side of the street and on the west side of the street, we're utilizing chicanes to be able to kind of switch parking both from the east and west side of the street. So it's not just going to be on one side of the street the entire way down, but we will be utilizing those chicanes to transition the parking both to the east and west side of the street. Next question will be for Liz and Bev. Under the plans with a bike path adjacent to the sidewalk, who's responsible for snow removal? And what accommodations have been made for deliveries, UPS, and everybody during construction?
So I can take maintenance responsibilities first. So the city is, under this design, would be responsible for the bicycle path portion for maintenance, both sweeping and snow removal of the bike path. Bev, can you take the second half of that question regarding construction?
Okay. Yes, during construction, there will be a, a project inspector as well as construction engineer to be on the project that can help coordinate any kind of special access needs, similar to what's happening on Bryant Avenue right now. That's kind of a rolling closure where some cross streets are closed just a few at a time. So it's not a total shutdown, and we work with the property owners and businesses to maintain their access as necessary. But the biggest thing is the point of contact that we'll have out there is chief field inspector, and frequent weekly stakeholder meetings, weekly project updates, and our phone numbers will be all over the place, so you can always get a hold of us.
Great, thank you for that answer, Liz and Bev. Next question will be geared for you, Trey, and the question is, seems like a really great design, but is there any way to make the protected bike lanes wider so that people can ride side by side along the corridor?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question. So City of Minneapolis typically likes to work within our constrained right of way, and so we know all along Bryant there are a lot of constraints. There are stairwells, there are nice big trees, there are fences, there are retaining walls, and when we are looking to kind of meet all our stakeholder feedback or our common stakeholder priority goals and our city goals, we know that we have a lot of demands in the street, and we want to maintain parking, and we want to maintain travel lane, we want to maintain a bicycle facility, and with all that comes space. And so to meet our street design guide, which recommends an 8 to a 10-foot bikeway, that's kind of where we landed with this proposal, to kind of in guidance with that street design guide, but also kind of hemmed in by those constraints.
Great, thank you, Trey. Liz will be coming to you for the next question overall. This is with relation to buses on Lyndale. It says Lyndale's already a busy street overall. Why can't buses stay on Bryant and move bikes to another street?
Yeah, so I touched on that a little bit, and there is, information online about the option where we would do that very thing, where we keep transit and move bicycles. But I mean, the short answer is, I kind of mentioned this before, when we look at the impacts of that option and the reality of what would be out there on the street, it doesn't do the best job at meeting the project goals and the stakeholder priorities for this project. And so we didn't move that one forward.
Great, thank you, Liz. Next question is actually for me again, and the question is, did you consider green space separating the bikeway from the pedestrian sidewalk? And the short answer to that is yes, we certainly did. We looked at, I think, over 13 different cross sections of what the kind of combination of sidewalk and bikeway could look like. And when we look at separating the actual bikeway from the pedestrian sidewalk overall, the big thing that comes down to is the amount of clear zone that we're required to provide for the bikeway. And knowing that it's not just trees and green space that's going in there, but there'll be light poles, there'll be traffic signs, there'll be a lot of different things that need to go in there. And by providing the separate or the green space in between the two, some of that space will be eaten up by the clear zone, and we can't put some of those other street furnishings and the trees in between as well. So we just kind of, again, we know this comes with a very constrained corridor from a horizontal perspective. So separating those in the clear zone that it creates by separating them takes up a lot of the space that could be used for other things if we keep them adjacent to each other.
And one thing to add on to that is that we have graphics showing that in the latest kind of layout package that help explain exactly what Greg just said. So you can hop over to the website and check out, I want to say it's page 6 of that layout package to see what Greg was saying.
Yep, great. Thanks for that addition, Liz. Next question will be for Cindy, or Liz if you want to chime in, that's great as well. But when BRT decisions are made, why do they have the option of in-lane stopping so that additional landscape would not be affected?
So arterial BRT, bus rapid transit, has been proposed for Lyndale Avenue South sometime before 2040, but we haven't gotten any more specific in terms of the timing for that. It is not one of the top 3 corridors that is moving ahead at this point, but our goal is that everything that had been identified on the list, there's an additional half dozen or so, would be in place by 2040. And so in terms of the timing of when that would happen, looking at most likely, the earliest would most likely be 2030 on that, sometime between 2030 and 2040. In terms of the inline bus stops, certainly there is, BRT, and if you've happened to have driven along Penn Avenue, for example, up in North Minneapolis where the C line is at, you can see a couple examples of this. There are a couple places where the buses are stopping in lane, and that means that the traffic is not able to go around. From a geometric perspective, that's what works for transit. Obviously, general purpose traffic that doesn't generally like to have to wait behind a bus and would prefer the ability to be able to pass. So we like to have the ability to pass, but can work under either situation.
Great, thanks a lot, Cindy, for that. Next question, we're going to pass over to Liz, and that's about right away. And question is, where are you planning to take privately owned property to meet your streetwide goals? How are you planning to buy that property from the residents?
We are not planning to take any private property whatsoever. We're working within our right-of-way, and actually we're working within what's called our effective right-of-way for this project. Through detailed design, we'll be looking more closely at each block and each foot of this project, but the goal of the project is to work within the effective right-of-way. And what that means is that we're trying not to disturb anything that it's an encroachment within the right-of-way. So as Trey mentioned, a lot of large trees, steps, fences. So we will not be taking any private property with this project.
Great, thank you for that, Liz. We'll be coming right back to you again for this next question. This is kind of about the overall cost of the project, and who is paying for the project overall, and why is that information not available on the website?
So as I mentioned at the beginning, roughly $2.2 million of this will come from assessments, and the rest will come from other city funds. So that means our general bond obligations, some other transfers from different types of funding that have to do with kind of the back end accounting of our capital improvement program. Those are all clearly listed, and I was trying to see if I can access the chat from my end, but I don't believe that I can. But they are all listed in what's called our capital budget requests. So if you look on our City of Minneapolis financial page, there is an entry for each capital budget request and the type of funding and what year the proposed funding is for each of our capital projects. So it's not on the Bryant Avenue website, it's on a separate page that our finance option maintains. And Trey, actually, if you know how to get to I don't know if we can get to the live Q&A section as producers. Otherwise, I can try and slot that into the chat here so people can see it.
I got it. I can send it.
Awesome, thank you.
Great, thank you for that, both Liz and Trey. Next question will stick with you, Liz. That is, can the bicycle path be moved on street like every other bicycle path?
So based on what we know from national experience, from what we hear from people when we go out and talk to them about projects like this, when we're talking about creating an all ages, all abilities network, people really don't like riding in the street. And so if we're trying to encourage people to use different types of transportation options, and if we're trying to give people the opportunity to do that in a way that's comfortable for them, City of Minneapolis is really moving towards building a network that takes cyclists out of the street and allows them to ride in their own separated space. So we know it's the best way to try and encourage a really wide range of users, because right now the people that use our existing transportation network as cyclists are, kind of our brave souls that can get to where they need to go on the street. So if we want to make sure that wider range of people is able to ride, we're looking to move it outside of the street itself where vehicles are moving.
Great answer. Thank you for that, Liz. Next question. Yep, we're going to stay right here with you, Liz. And that is, why are we maintaining so much free parking on the street?
So we're trying to balance in again how people use this street today and how we need to use it into the future. We're removing a lot of on-street parking from the street, just to be very frank. This will be a very large change from the way this street operates today. And the way we made these decisions was really on a block by block basis. So we looked at what our peak parking counts were today on Bryant, as well as on the cross streets. And then we looked at what we could accommodate for during that peak hour on both the cross street on either side and Bryant itself. And that's how we tried to hone in on the appropriate amount of parking spaces to provide along this corridor. Definitely a difficult balancing act, but the numbers we came up with are our best take at balancing all those needs within the right of way.
Great, thank you for that, Liz. I did post up the instructions again. If you do have more questions, again, feel free to type them in. We're here or seeing as many as we can and publishing them, and we'll be answering here as many as we can. Next question, Liz, does actually stick with you again. And that question is, when will we actually make the concept design recommendation to City Council?
Good question. So we are planning to take this to the Transportation and Public Works Committee as the first place it goes, which is a subcommittee of the full City Council on August 11th.
Great, short and sweet answer. Trey, we're going to come to you next overall, and that is, question is, why does the city keep putting bike lanes on Arterial Street? Why can't the city accommodate safe bicycle flow on side streets and half block adjacent from busy arterials with buses, trucks, and simply higher vehicle use?
Definitely, good question. So first part of that question is that in our transportation action plan, our 10-year transportation plan for how we build out our modal networks, we have our AAA, our all ages, all abilities bikeway network that identifies Bryant as a bikeway. Identifies many streets as bikeway, but also Bryant as a near-term low stress bikeway. Bryant in specific isn't an arterial. It's the traffic that we see on Bryant is more so close to a residential street. In addition to that, bicyclists also need a direct route to destinations, just as people in cars do. We're both people traveling on the street, so we both go to the same places, and so it's to provide that level of access and that level of comfort. It's one of the reasons, in addition to following some of the city policy, why we put bikes on streets like Bryant.
And I want to add one thing to that is that, I mean, we, as you saw, looked at alternative routes for Bryant. And one of the big sticking points that we run into when we're trying to look at an alternative or an adjacent network is that we don't have existing traffic control devices. So our streetlights or specifically streetlights at our busiest intersections. So for those of you who, are out there riding Aldridge, when I ride Aldridge with my kids, they're little enough that they're on the back of my bike right now. But it can be dicey when I'm trying to, get up a hill or get up the speed to cross a street that is really busy, like, our 46th Street or 36th Street, 35th. And when we're talking about making that, comfortable, safe crossing for people of all abilities and making it, encouraging that type of user to bike, it gets really difficult to make those investments and retrofit an adjacent bikeway on top of a reconstruction project when we're looking at spending that much city funding in one section of the city.
Great. Thanks a lot, Trey and Liz, on that one. Liz, we're going to come back to you with the next one. The next question is, can you tell us the latest plans about connecting these bike lanes up to the Midtown Greenway?
Yeah, so we know that is obviously a critical connection. Bike networks don't work very well if they're not connected, right? So right now we have Bicycle Boulevard from that section of Lake up to the Greenway and further north. We are continuing to explore what a facility could look like on those blocks to make that connection. It is not currently part of this proposed project, but we're looking at different ways that we could make that connection, because we know it's a really important one as we continue to build out our network.
Thank you, Liz. Next question, Trey, we're going to come your way this time. And the question is, how many bicyclists currently use the streets and what is the current accident rate?
Good question. So I don't have that information in front of me, but we do have it posted on our website. If you go to our project resources, we have an existing conditions document that you can present that document for information on accidents and number of bicyclists traveling the corridor.
Thank you, Trey. I think the next question is going to stick with you again. And where can I find the studies on bike lane options on streets other than Bryant Avenue?
Also a good question. I can give you a lot of material, but I'll keep it succinct. On our website, the city's website for the street design guide, which I'll post in chat, you can use that to evaluate options for how we design AAA facilities. Great.
Thank you, Trey. We'll look forward to seeing that in the chat. Next question will be for Liz. And the question is, if the bike lanes were made wide enough to ride side by side, then which side would be chosen, east or west? And how would that affect other forms of transportation along the corridor?
So, because I'm not 100% sure about how those two pieces of the question fit together, but I'll say that we looked at putting the trail on both the east or west side. We did a full analysis of the impacts of that and the pros and cons. First of all, when you're talking about land uses and connections, we really, again, trying to avoid putting a bike lane, a bike facility in front of Clara Barton School, given the way that loading and unloading works. We looked at trying to make connections to parks. Fortunately, I don't want to say unfortunately, there's a park on either side of the corridor when you're trying to make that connection. We looked at the number of driveways crossed, and it was about equal on either side. And then lastly, when we looked at putting the trail on the east side of the street as we're recommending, we really wanted it to line up with the way that further north of the corridor, north of Lake Street, works to make that connection as safe and as comfortable as it could be. But definitely was a little bit of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And a couple of those things, as I mentioned, the connection at Lake Street, Clara Barton tipped the scales for us to make that recommendation. In terms of if it was wider, I think we'd really go with the same side of the street if the trail itself was wider, and I don't think the width of the trail would change our decision making for that.
Great, thank you, Liz. Next question overall, we'll stick with Liz as well. We'll say, don't you feel like Lyndale is busy enough right now without buses? Are you really trying to add more buses and traffic onto Lyndale?
So one thing to know about Lyndale, and we know this, and obviously people who live in Lyndale really know this, is that with the 35W construction, Lyndale saw just an extremely large increase in traffic volumes over the last couple of years. When 35W is fully reopened, we do expect that to subside. We know it takes a bit for people to have, new patterns of their commuting, but we definitely don't think that is going to be as high as it has been these past few years. When we're talking about, congestion and transit impacts, as Trey kind of reviewed, the adding buses to Lyndale doesn't change that overall travel time. And also, if you're thinking about the numbers of buses that come through here, in the peak hour, some of our busiest times under this proposal, there'll be approximately 9 to 10 buses running through here. And we compare that to other heavy vehicles along Lyndale, it's actually a modest comparison to what is currently out there today. So we know that it will be different on Lyndale, but if we think about the type of traffic that is already out there, the addition of buses is really not that different from the typical amount and type of traffic that travels on Lyndale today.
Great, thanks a lot, Liz. We do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we do realize that it is 9 o'clock. I believe city staff are willing to stick around for a little bit more and continue to try and answer more questions as we go through. But do want to feel respectful of time. If you do need to jump off, feel free to jump off at any time. And I believe this presentation will be posted to the city's website. And we'll also be posting the Q&A on the website as well. Thank you for that, Trey. So with that, we'll continue to ask her a couple more questions. So Bev, this next one will be coming to you. The question is about construction staging. And the question is, can you tell me what phase 1 and phase 2 of construction actually means?
Good question. phase 1 and phase 2 is just what we'll do in the first year and what we'll do in the second year. At this point, we do not have that planned out at this time, but we do just know that there's going to be 2 chunks of the project, or 2 years of construction.
Great, thank you for that update, Bev. Next question will go back to Liz, and this is a question about stop signs, and the question is, are you going to add the stop signs at 44th Street?
At the moment, no. Public Works is not recommending adding an additional stop sign at 44th Street.
Great. And then next question also for you, Liz, is shouldn't the bike lanes be more correctly referred to as micro-mobility lanes?
Sure. Yes, scooters will definitely be allowed in the bike lanes themselves. Yes.
Great. Thank you for that. And then Trey or Liz, both of you, this is a question for either one of you. And the question will be, what is meant by maintaining vehicular access?
So we looked at maintaining vehicular access. We looked at people's ability to reach destinations along the street, and whether that, you know, was coming from the north or south or southern direction, being able to access on the cross streets. At some point in time, people had asked us to put in items similar that would block the intersection, so people would have to traffic diverters. They wanted us to divert traffic on Bryant. Given Bryant's status as, you know, a mixed corridor with business nodes and residential land uses along the corridor, we didn't think that was something we wanted to bring forward as a recommendation in terms of making the corridor difficult to navigate for people who are driving. So those are kind of some of the things that we looked at when we talk about maintaining vehicular access.
Great, thank you, Liz. We're going to stick right back with you with the next question as well. And that question is, why is the boulevard needed along 38th to 39th in front of the Farmstead Park? There's a large park right there, and why don't we say that's boulevard space for anything else?
Sure. Good question. I think one of the main reasons for that is that we will be a couple main reasons. First, we'll be reconstructing just within our right of way, and so we will be able to use that area to put in green stormwater infrastructure. So there's a whole range of technical things that could be. So sometimes that's, you know, underground basins of some sort. Sometimes that's a rain garden. But for City of Minneapolis, it's really important for us to be able to manage our stormwater via some sort of those features. And so we don't know exactly where those features will be yet or what exactly they'll be, but we are carving out space in this phase of the project to ensure that we can put those types of items within the street without impacting the existing parkland. The other reason is we want to make sure we have as many opportunities as possible to plant trees, specifically large trees along Bryant. We know that in some of those locations along the park, there's some existing trees already, but we want to carve out as much space possible to add to the tree canopy in this area to make it more comfortable for people who are walking along Bryant.
Great, thank you. Liz, next question is also going to come right back to you as well. And that question is, how does this project relate to future construction projects? When Bryant north of Lake Street's eventually redone, is it assumed that this same construction or the same idea will happen further north of this intersection as well?
So Bryant north of Lake is a really different type of street. It's really strictly more residential. It's been reconstructed. Oh man, I want to say, I think it was, I don't remember when the last exact reconstruct of it was, but I've checked that multiple times for stakeholders throughout this process. And it is not within the city's probably 20 years of trying to reinvest in that corridor given its existing age and asset condition. So I wouldn't want to speak to what decisions might be made within 20 years for that cross section and what it might look like, but I'd say it's just a very different type of street and might see a completely different treatment.
Great, thank you, Liz. Next question, again, is going to come back to you, Liz, if you want me to chime in, let me know. But question is that the converging one-way at 46 is confusing. We prefer this to go all the way down to 50th Street. Can we tell us why that idea was rejected, and why couldn't we just change the one-way that's on Aldrich back to the opposite direction instead of having a converging one-way on Bryant?
Yeah, Greg, definitely feel free to jump in. I can start. So we did look at that option. One of the things is that we know that the 50th and Bryant intersection is a really busy intersection, and it's a location where we want to make sure that people have access to the parking that we're trying to provide on both sides of the block from 50th to 49th. And so that people have an easy way to access that parking off of 50th. So that's one reason. Other reason is that we did look at potentially changing that traffic pattern on Aldrich itself. What we found is that we talked to our traffic operations people and about what they had heard when that had gone in, and that it was really doing what it was supposed to be doing in terms of discouraging cut through traffic from Lyndale. We also looked at what it would mean to make to change the conversion point to a different point in 46. And Greg, I'll let you fill in with anything that I kind of missed there.
I think you covered most of the points that we had talked about previously, so I think you did a good job covering that. So we can jump down to the next question. This will be again for Liz, or if any of our Hennepin County representatives want to chime in as well, feel free. Question is, how is the project goal of improving pedestrian safety across Lyndale being achieved? Access, adding more transit or traffic to an already busy street is jeopardizing the safety of that street.
So I guess I would disagree with the definition of pedestrian safety. So you are correct that we would be adding some vehicles to Lyndale, some of which are in the form of buses. But when you look at our traffic safety data and what happened to Lyndale after it was changed from a 4-lane undivided street to the design that it is today, the safety numbers are much improved. So when you look at Lyndale, there's wide boulevards, there's sidewalks, there's a lot of signalized crossings at our busiest streets. So I would disagree with the way that question was framed up initially. And I'd say that the changes on Lyndale really set us up well to have a transit supportive corridor with the design that's out there today.
Great. Thanks a lot, Liz. Bev, next question will be coming with that.
I just wanted to add that the changes on Lyndale also include those medians that were shown earlier, which will make it, those intersections will be safer for vehicles and for people crossing as well.
Very true, great point. Thanks a lot, David, for chiming in on that one. Bev, next question will be for you. And the question is, regardless of the final design of whatever's approved, will the city be ripping out the entire street like what's happening on Bryant Avenue right now?
Yes, for Bryant Avenue, it will be a total replacement of the sidewalk, the curbs, and the streets. And I'll add that we're looking at, the condition of the underground utilities, such as the water, sewer, and sanitary, to make sure that those, if there's upgrades that are necessary, those are done in coordination with the project as well.
Great, thank you, Bev. Liz, we're going to come back to you with this next question, and that is, how do you project what the future needs of Bryant will be in 20 years?
So we do that based on our city policy guidance. So through the city's, planning through Minneapolis 2040, as well as through our transportation action plan. There's a lot of outreach done to create policy guidance that would lead us to how we want to build out our city for the future. So it's a lot of talking to stakeholders, relying on existing policy, and then having conversations throughout the project process for what people specifically wanted to see on Bryant Avenue itself.
All right. Thanks a lot for that response, Liz. Liz, or Trey, you might be able to take this one. The next question is, what is the purpose of showing current parking levels? If the city has climate goals of switching mode shares to more transit, pedestrian, bikes, why not focus and design to that future need instead of the current?
Definitely, yeah. Good question. So we know that, as I mentioned earlier, Bryant is a constrained core, and that those constraints also come to driveways and the existence of alleys in the back of folks' yards. For most of the corridor, or for parts in the corridor. Not alleys aren't accessible for a lot of parcels or a lot of blocks, but also there are driveways on nearly every block of Bryant. And so when you think about, how do we accommodate those needs, we got to work within those constraints. And when there isn't any alleys in the back of someone's yard, or someone doesn't have a driveway, there's reasonable need for them to have some kind of parking accommodation. And it's our responsibility to right size that parking and to not provide too much where we have issues with speeding, or provide too little where we have cars circling the block looking for parking.
Great, thank you for that response, Trey. Liz, we're going to come back to you with a question on traffic calming. And that is, are you open to adding speed bumps or more stop signs to ensure that traffic velocities will actually be constrained along the corridor?
So at the moment, we are not proposing speed bumps or stop signs in terms of speed control along Bryant Avenue or on the adjacent streets. I'll say that we have taken pre-construction speeds and count data on Bryant itself, and we're working to gather that data on our adjacent streets as well. So we have a true understanding of what Bryant and the adjacent streets are experiencing today before the project goes in. And then after the project, we'll evaluate how the project is working and what the changes might need to try and address any issues that may come up.
Great. Thank you again, Liz. Look, stick with you with another question for engagement. Question overall is, it feels like we're on the backside of COVID at the moment. Will there be any process for face-to-face communication and further engagement on this project as we move forward?
No, unfortunately not. So given that City of Minneapolis is still within the state of emergency, we are keeping our public engagement to a virtual setting, so we can keep this project on track and on schedule. I'll say that this project was fast-tracked within the CIP. When we had originally started this project or put it into the CIP, it was slated to begin in 2023. And due to stakeholder concerns about the existing assets on the corridor, Public Works recommended fast tracking that project and moving it up to 2022. So to continue to answer that existing concern about asset condition, we are moving forward with this project to keep it on schedule.
Great, thanks a lot, Liz. I think we got time for at least one more question here, so we'll go back to you, Liz, with another question on assessments. And that is, are Bryant Avenue residents the only people being responsible for assessments on this, or will Lyndale Avenue residents be charged assessments as well for that portion?
So Lyndale Avenue was recently reconstructed, and so when we're looking, what we're talking about is really a very light retrofit to the curb lines of Lyndale, and City of Minneapolis does not assess for retrofit designs like that. There are three main categories that City of Minneapolis would assess for. So that'd be a reconstruction, a resurfacing, or a rehabilitation of the street. And the improvements that we're proposing on Lyndale do not rise to what those items are. The reconstruction on Bryant would be, that full reconstruction, and then and therefore would be assessed at that full reconstruction rate.
Great, thanks a lot, Liz. And with that, I believe it is 9:15. Liz or Chair, was there any other things that you wanted to touch base on before we end this meeting today?
Yes. I just want to thank, go ahead, Trey, you go first.
No, that's the last slide. You can go ahead, Liz.
There we go. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight and coming along with us via this virtual engagement session. Do feel free to reach out to us if you want to have more detailed conversations. We can point you to where things are in the website. And again, we will be taking this forward to the City Council on August 11th at the Transportation and Public Works Committee of the City Council. I think that's it. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.